Welcome back to the Happy Cynics, everybody. In this episode, we are revisiting our conversation about the pre-scientific and post-scientific worldview and sort of defining the differences and the tensions and reasons why you should adopt a scientific worldview for yourself.
Yes.
With me is DJ Dr. K.
Hey. All right. Yeah, I'm ready to go. And did you introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah. This is the all-seeing eye, Isaac.
All right. Well, we were talking about the pre-scientific worldview. And so in talking about a scientific worldview, even the way, say, thinkers, philosophers, scientists, and others started to view knowledge changed. We had already talked about empiricism with the recovery of Aristotle. But then the gradual replacement of Platonism with Aristotelianism or empiricism also took some other forms as well. So
right.
Plato's whole thing was, you talk about the forms of the universals. Well, in the scholastic period, there, like William of Ockham was a guy who really pushed back against Platonism pretty hard. So two things that he argued for. One was what we call nominalism. Okay, so nominalism, what that is he says that we cannot say what the universals are. We can only talk about the particulars that we experience. And John Locke picks up on this in his essay concerning human understanding, and he agrees and then also applies this to language. So here's kind of what this means. I use the illustration of a chair and Plato's worldview. There's like the perfect.
Right, there's the perfect chair.
Right, the perfect chair, and then every chair that in the material world has a degree of chairness or whatever. Now, what Occam says is, no, we can't talk about what the perfect chair is. We can only know chairs to the extent that we experience them. So it would be like saying, how much can somebody who has spent his or her entire life at the equator be able to tell you about snow? If they've never seen a picture of it or anything like that, if they've never experienced it in any way, or let's just say, how could somebody who's never tasted chocolate imagine what it tastes like? Something along those lines,
right? So that we are not like pre-programmed with ideas, and experiences. We have to acquire experience through our senses, to know anything.
There is no perfect perspective as such. We all have different experiences. So like everybody has experienced different types of chairs. Okay. And we could talk about, rocking chair, high chair, easy chair, electric chair, barber chair. All these have different characteristics. I mean, they're all something that you sit on, rest your posterior on. But I guess, remember the old show Mork and Mindy? Did you ever see reruns of that? With Robin Williams, he was Mork from Mork.
Yeah.
And then
he's the alien, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And whenever he would sit down, he would basically just put his head upside down on the seat or the couch or whatever. And that was the way he sat down. But anyway, nominalism says we cannot speak of universals. We can only speak of particulars, and then we generalize from the particulars. So we just look at the common characteristics. So this is the beginning of, say, scientific thought. You're making observations, and this is kind of what Francis Bacon incorporated into the scientific method. So in the scientific method, you're basically just you decide what it is you want to study. You start making some observations, and then you control variables so you can isolate variables and see how one affects the other to try to find a pattern. And then you break down your observations by categories, classify them in some way, But you're doing this by saying, what do they have in common? What's different? So like if I were talking about, what would be the best chair for lumbar support, for example? Mm-hmm. Okay. Then you would start to measure this in some way, and the different kinds of chairs you would look at, do something to measure lumbar support, and then you would have some other kind of characteristic or whatever it may be. Okay. Maybe the amount of the degree.
And like,
go ahead.
This practice of like the observation experiment categorization is like exactly how Aristotle described the task of philosophy, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
That
right.
You break things down into categories and then subcategories and then subcategories.
Right.
And this is actually where, like, I think we adopted a lot of his nomenclature for the like organization of species and genus and family and kingdom and all those sorts of things. Like that's part of the purpose of the scientific worldview is categorize everything.
Right. Right. Yes. And really what science is us looking for patterns and then trying to create a model to describe those patterns. That model could be a geometric model. It could be a mathematical model. There's different, but models don't have to be geometric or mathematical. So like, say Freud's, theories, with the ego, the superego, and the id, and those kinds of things.
Right. They have to be relational, though.
Right.
Like categories must be some type of relational category, right? Chairs are things you sit on.
Right. Yeah. So they have to be related to one another so you can make a comparison contrast.
Right.
And the other thing is that the categories that you make, like you have to define what the category represents. So you have to make sure that's well defined. So just like this is where when Freud's talking about the superego, well, then he's got to put that in other terms because you have to be able to relate that to something empirical for it to make sense.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and the categories have to be accurate.
Right.
They have to correspond to reality.
Right. So really, this is what you're doing. Now, when it comes to creating models, the way they decide, there's a number of principles that are followed in determining what's a better model. Is one model better than another? And I don't want to get into Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, and whether that process is subjective or to what extent it's subjective or not. I don't really want to get into that in this episode. I'm not really convinced by Kuhn's idea that models are just arbitrary and depends on what the scientists want to study. I don't think it's that arbitrary. Because let's put it this way, models, anytime a new model replaces an old model, okay, the new model has to account for all the data that the previous model did. It has to be an improvement. Right. It has to be at least as accurate. Okay. And then it enables the scientist to extend beyond what the old model was able to explain. It has to be able to account for the new data that's coming in and do it more efficiently. And then it's also adding to the prediction power, predictability.
Right. Well, and that what you just described, that like a new scientific model has to account for the previous data as well as new data. Right. That kind of brings us back to William of Ockham and Occam's razor.
Well, that's where I was going, because another one of the criteria is that typically a new model ends up being simpler and more efficient than old models. Because what happens over time is an old model, you end up making some new observations that don't fit the old model. So then the old model gets altered in some way. Okay. So like, for example, the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Thomas Aquinas uses Aristotle's metaphysics to develop this really convoluted explanation of how the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, but just with the properties of bread and wine. So the bread becomes the body of Christ with the properties of bread, and then the wine becomes the blood of Christ with the properties of wine. And he's using like form and essence and substance and accidents and all these other kinds of technical gobbledygook terms. Well, Occam's razor, Occam said the simplest adequate explanation is most likely the correct one. Now,
so defining what those terms mean, because simple is not just like easy to understand. Simple means least amount of assumptions required, right? That I think that's a really important part of Occam's razor that gets neglected. That when he says the simplest, he doesn't mean like, okay, so like the plum pudding model of the atom is simpler than the current model of the atom with like an electron cloud and electrons coming in and out of existence at different points. Like that's more complicated, but it requires less assumptions and explains more data.
Yes, that is true. Yes, and that's also accounted for in the idea that it has to be an adequate explanation.
Yes.
Okay, so the simplest adequate explanation. So some explanations are overly simplistic. They're inadequate. And why are they inadequate? Because they don't take all of the evidence into consideration. Okay?
Right.
So you're basically looking for a model to explain the phenomena that you've observed. Like the plum pudding model, or let's just say answers in Genesis. Okay.
Sure.
Well, they've got to somehow get rid of carbon dating, and So anyway, you either ignore it, and then you have a simple explanation that's not really adequate because it's not taking everything in consideration, or you have an overly complicated, a convoluted explanation, which the reason the explanation becomes too convoluted is because somebody is trying to explain away evidence that
disproves the model.
That disproves the model and goes against it.
I think, so this comes from Answers in Genesis, but I think a good example of what I'm trying to say about the Occam's razor isn't a friend to preconceived assumptions.
No.
So Answers in Genesis gets the question of how, if the universe is only 6,000 years old, can we see light from stars that are more than 6,000 light years away?
Right.
And what Answers in Genesis say is the explanation for that is that light only moves at a constant speed in one direction away from us. So,
oh my golly.
God, this is real. You can go on their website and look this up, and it's hysterical. But that, God causes light traveling towards us to move faster than the speed of light in order to make the universe look older, or for some reason. They never go into why. But the reason that that explanation is ruled out by Occam's razor is because you have to assume that there is a God, that God did this thing, and that the reason God did this thing is, there's a whole list of assumptions. So say you want to explain all natural phenomena by saying, oh, we exist in the dream of some, ancient being, right? That is totally beyond us. We're all living in this dream. Well, that may explain everything, and it might be simple, but because it requires this massive assumption to backload all of the explanatory power, Occam's razor rules it out. Yeah.
I want to nuance that. I want to nuance that just a bit. And the reason is because the way you are framing it, some people respond by saying, well, you are making assumptions about our observations and how accurate our observations are. And like, in other words, they go the route then of saying, well, everything is relative. Everything's based on some sort of assumptions. And then they just try to basically argue out like with an utter relativism.
Well, maybe Hume could help us here.
Well, I think better than Hume. You can bring Hume in, but I was going to go straight for like postmodern coherence theory, because it's just like our senses. There's no given test. It's just not a blind assumption that my eyesight is reliable. And there's not a test that I can prove that everything that I see is exactly the way it is. But the reason I trust my eyesight is because my eyes have been giving me coherent information throughout my entire conscious life. And so as long as those experiences hold together and reinforce one another, I'm safe. I can still regard my eyes as reliable because they have proven to be reliable in the past.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that's kind of a similar place I was going to go with Hume, that like, you still have to make the assumption that there is some external referent that is true, that you are sensing in reality. Right. And that's the big assumption that like the pre-scientific people want to throw at us to ruin Occam's razor. But the idea in science is that you would have proportional evidence to certainty, whereas the pre-scientific worldview demands absolute certainty.
Yeah.
And I think that is like the big difference that sort of allows the scientific worldview to get around that assumption. Like, we only claim knowledge as there is proportional evidence to support those claims.
I don't think a pre-scientific worldview demands absolute certainty, but I think it permits it. And that's where people take it. Because
and science precludes it.
There are religions that tend to be more agnostic.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm just saying that in fairness to them. So, say like Confucian thought or Taoism, Buddhism to a certain extent. There's a certain agnosticism to some of it, not all of it. But yeah, so it's, yes, this dogmatism, where does that come from? I think it's permitted because there's nothing to disprove anything. And that's why people continue to be dogmatic about metaphysical or religious beliefs, because they can't be disproven. Now, where the coherence theory comes in is if you don't have any kind of unifying experiences to establish coherence, then it is just a blind assumption. And the logical positivists basically wanted to rule out any kind of assumption like that. So that would be more how I would process all of this, through the lens of both logical positivism and then somebody like Kuhn. Because basically when a model breaks down, Kuhn wants to say, and there are other philosophers that say, basically you can't judge models like a piece at a time. You have to, like, there's this entire explanation and then there's this entire explanation. There's model A and model B. And so model A works not as well as model B, so we're going to switch to model B. And I think there is a broader, observation. So this is some of the things that comes from, Aristotle and the scholastics, and even up through Kant and Kant's categories of the a priori. So there are certain things like space and time and causality and things like that are what I would call maybe like an observation model of just what reality is. That there's dimensions and and things like that, and there's unity and plurality and concepts like this. And that really is where models get adapted. Because if there weren't if there weren't some broader language to critique parts of models, we would never adapt them. So even Kuhn, I think, kind of contradicts himself to a point. And von Quine kind of argued along these lines too. I think he was, if I'm understanding him correctly, I may be misunderstanding what exactly he was saying there. But I don't agree. I think that there's like, in other words, we just still come back to basic observation and like how we start making sense of the world even when we're kids. So even without a scientific model or understanding, like I think the average person still knows about space and time and causality and things like that. And this is how this is how we make adjustments to scientific models. So anyway, but Occam's razor. So let me circle back to that, unless I don't want to cut off anything you wanted to say here, though. But Occam's, go ahead.
I mean, this might be another tangent, but with the coherence theory, there is an assumption that eventually there is a coherent theory of everything. I'm curious if you're optimistic about that theory's existence.
That's a good question. I would think probably at some point there is, but I think probably I would say it's more likely than not, just because even the different ways that we view the world, it's just say like let's just take something like classical mechanics versus quantum mechanics. Okay. Or like, is light a wave or a particle, or things like that?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So I think there is hope for there being some kind of unifying theory, because after all, there does seem to be a correspondence between the two. And as long as there's a correspondence between them, well, then that does tend to lend itself toward, there probably is an explanation as to why these things come together at some point, that they are part of the same reality, although we don't know that why in one frame of reference it appears this way, in another frame of reference it appears another way. And it may just even be something unifying in the way that we're experiencing reality. So anyway, yes, I would be optimistic that there is. Now, how complicated that would be and how long it would take us to get there, I could only
potentially
venture a
we
guess.
should do an episode of the Philosopher's Corner, maybe a bonus episode for certain people.
We could. We still haven't released our other ones.
Yeah, on materialism and idealism and the problems of the infinite.
Yes.
in those regards.
Oh yeah.
But back to Occam's razor before we get too far down into the weeds here.
So Occam's razor, and the reason it's called the razor, is because it comes in and when there's a simpler, adequate explanation, then that is most likely the correct one, and it shaves away all these convoluted explanations. So, using our examples, Thomas Aquinas, an argument about transubstantiation. Occam's razor comes in and says, maybe it's just bread and wine.
Right.
Okay. Answers in Genesis. Maybe maybe the universe is very, very, very old.
Right.
Maybe the story you're putting so much stock in is actually a myth or based on a myth. Okay. Which actually it is based on an earlier myth, but nevertheless, that's a simpler explanation.
Right.
Basically, people decide what it is that they want to believe. And then whenever evidence goes up against it, they've got to basically work their tails off and twist themselves into pretzels to somehow make this evidence go away or make it seem irrelevant. And that's really what's going on here. So that would be the first thing. Like, let's talk about what is a scientific worldview. Well, I would say in a broad sense, without getting it, and I do want to kind of get into like, what are the things we know about the world that really should influence the way people think about their daily lives? Well, the first thing is even the way people view knowledge, okay, and just natural processes. What counts as knowledge and evidence, the importance of empirical evidence, even the notion of giving more credence to things that are, the more they're observed. Like if you only observe something once or twice, well, then when you draw a conclusion, we say you jump to a conclusion. It's just like the guy who said, the missionary said, yeah, the country where, I visited this country and, all the natives there walk in single file. And he says, they do? He says, well, at least the one person I saw did. And so, but it's like, if you see something once or twice, well, that might not be enough to draw a broader conclusion about what's going on. And I use this illustration. Let's say, I say, okay, students on this campus are not friendly. Why? Why would I say that? Okay, well, I passed 2 different students today, and neither of them would look at me or say hi, even whenever I smiled and waved at them. Well, can you really make a blanket generalization just on passing 2 students? Now, there could still be something there, but that's very weak evidence. Now, let's suppose instead of it being 2 students, let's say this happens 20 times in a row over a period of maybe 3-4 months or whatever. Like the more observation there gets, and then it starts to build up. This would be another way where, see, here's the thing. Some people will base their beliefs on just some one-time event, like, oh, I witnessed a miracle or whatever. If somebody were witnessing like a miracle every other day or whatever, first they wouldn't call it a miracle. This is really Hume's argument.
Yeah, we're into Hume now.
Right. This is Hume's argument on why there's really not a rational basis for saying I witnessed a miracle. Because if you witnessed it enough to give it some sort of certainty, well, then you'd say it was probably a coincidence or there's probably something going on we don't understand.
Right.
But when it only happens...
And the very definition of a miracle sort of disproves the rationality of miracles themselves, because it, by definition, has to go against conventional, like...
experience.
Yeah, conventional experience.
Right.
Like, it has to contradict the vast majority of the evidence we have.
Right. And, of course, belief in a miracle is premised on ignorance. And so what may seem like a miracle now may have an explanation, a century from now, or even a decade from now. You never know. Now, that's not to say that somebody can't believe in miracles, but here is, again, my point. People will take what I would consider a pre-scientific worldview is you take isolated events and then you form your life philosophy around them instead of forming your life philosophy around the things that happen on a day-to-day basis. And then just simply enjoying the serendipitous things that maybe happen once in a while. So let's put it this way. If somebody thinks that, Aunt Gertrude's, God made Aunt Gertrude's tumor go away, okay, that's fine, but that should not become a reason for anybody else not getting treatment from an oncologist when they've got cancer or they're having some kind of symptoms, okay? And so when we're talking about a scientific worldview, we're talking about basically allowing what human beings as a whole have learned and allow that to sink in and affect the way we view the world. There is... Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that we touched on earlier, but I would like to dig into a little bit more, is that idea that the scientific worldview doesn't acknowledge absolute certainty in any case.
No. It absolutely not.
It's always about it's always proportional certainty. It's I have this amount of evidence,
Right.
and therefore I am that directly based on that evidence. That's how certain I am.
Yeah,
Like,
it's what's called evidentialism. Now,
yeah,
I will say this. All right, if you want to, if I cut you off in the middle of something you were
go
pursuing, this issue came up with the advent of American pragmatism. Okay, so this was something that was even a bone of contention between Pierce and James, Charles Saunders Pierce and William James. So the short answer for those of you following along here is this. Evidentialism is the idea that you should only be as certain as the evidence will dictate. Like if you have strong evidence, then you can have more certainty. If you have very weak evidence, you should not hold that belief with much certainty. Now, that kind of thinking goes even back to ancient Greece. There was an ancient skeptic named Pyrrho that Hume said took it too far, like Descartes did, where you're like doubting everything. But then there was Sextus Empiricus, who basically said that certainty should be gauged on the evidence, okay, or the reasons, for it. Well, William Clifford was a guy who, in the middle of the 19th century, wrote an essay called The Ethics of Belief. He ended up dying of tuberculosis in his 30s. So by the time William James got around to responding to it towards the end of the 19th century, Clifford had been long gone. But here's the thing. The American pragmatist, okay, so this has been kind of the thing. Early scientists, like in the early Enlightenment, believed that our observations are pretty objective and, say, value neutral. They started to question this a little later, and it's like, okay, like, is light a wave or a particle? And then some, by the middle of the 20th century, saying, well, maybe it just depends on what you're looking for. Maybe people see what they expect to see. And so this whole idea about how objective is empirical experience, that they started to question that. Well, Pierce and James, the pragmatist, and then later John Dewey, basically argued that we're always reasoning for some kind of practical reason. All right. Well, Charles Saunders Pierce said we have to acknowledge our own biases and our own errors in judgment and things, but we should use the scientific method to try to eliminate that subjectivity or minimize it, at least, in our day-to-day lives. Now, William James disagreed with that because he was first and foremost a psychologist. And he basically said there are things that are worthwhile believing in life that don't really have hard evidence. And he laid out several criteria. As long as you have some empirical basis for it, and two, there's not strong empirical evidence against it, and three, the belief serves some sort of practical, useful purpose, then you're justified in believing it on weak evidence. Now, yeah, go ahead.
In this, especially the bias conversation, it gets taken up in social science all the time.
Okay.
And I don't think I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I'm currently in an anthropology degree. And this gets discussed all the time. And we talk a lot about, I think Husserl and Heidegger as the two sort of solutions to these problems with
phenomenalism.
Phenomenology. Yeah. Because I forget what Heidegger calls it, the circle of, the hermeneutic circle.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
From Heidegger, where you acknowledge that you come into a phenomena, observing a phenomena with certain biases, but you, by traveling around the hermeneutic circle, what you do is, so the first step, acknowledge your biases, then make an observation and allow that observation to reinform your biases and then make your observation again, right? And do that loop multiple times where you're allowing your evidence basically to build your biases so that even your biases are evidence-based.
Right.
And that's how you can kind of circumvent your own inability to observe the truth. Now, this is particularly applicable in social sciences, where everybody comes preloaded with a lot of ideas.
Yeah, because a lot of the biases are based on past experience.
They're social biases.
Right. But that's the problem, that people end up, and this was one of William James's arguments. He argued that psychologically we can't sit on the fence. Now, the like Sextus Empiricus and Pierce and Clifford, they believe that yes, you can kind of sit on the fence. Now, this gets thrown out there.
Well, that's Husserl's opinion too, that you can bracket your own biases, which I think he's wrong. I think Heidegger's right, that you have to just acknowledge your biases and let the evidence shape them. I
agree. I do think that's right. Boy, oh boy. Well, let's put it this way. You might suspend belief in the sense of limiting your certainty, but you do have to decide whether you are or are not going to act on something. So that's kind of where I would kind of split this. So like even whenever it gets to discussions about theism, belief in God, so some people would say, okay, if you're going to be intellectually honest, then you're kind of left with agnosticism. But there are people who say they're agnostic, they get hammered from both sides by both theists and atheists, because the theists say, okay, you say you're agnostic, but you are not like going to church half the time and praying and reading your Bible half the time.
Right.
You basically live like John Wesley said, that agnostics are practical atheists.
Yeah.
Okay. Then on the other hand, the atheists say, well, atheism, atheism is not just, I believe that there's no God, but I'm not convinced that there's a God. And so they say that the agnostics are just too chicken, too cowardly to admit that they're atheists.
Right.
So I would say this, somebody, I think in terms of certainty and drawing conclusions, could keep, like, let's say you put an asterisk there. I mean, yeah, you are going to have to decide which way you're going to come down. Am I going to live? Because one way or the other, I'm going to have to trust it one way or the other. It's just like whenever you get married, okay? You're putting your trust in somebody. You are now, vulnerable to being taken advantage of financially, emotionally, whatever, okay? And so you have to come down on one side or the other, and some people back out because they're afraid to commit or whatever. But that certainty can grow over time based on more observation.
This is I think one of the powers of the scientific worldview is that it gives you the tools with which to reinform your biases so that you can make a decision based on evidence.
Yes. Now, where I think this goes askew for some people is that they will take their experiences as a way of giving them more certainty, but that's because they're already interpreting their experiences in a pre-scientific way. They're not. So here's what I want to say. Somebody has a strong impression and says, "Oh, I feel like God told me to change my major." Okay.
Right.
And so they drop out of one program and then go get a new advisor and join another program. Well, then the more times they have these like whims, they become more convinced that God really is talking to them. even though there's like social science that would maybe explain where these premonitions are coming from, that it may not be some mystic vision or miracle. It may actually just be coming from something that your parents or your grandmother or somebody told you when you were a little kid.
Yeah, well, and like to go back to your example earlier with your student who came to you for advice,
right?
I think a lot of that stuff that we interpret as, well, God told me to, ends up being, this is what I wanted to hear. Mm-hmm. It's like going to yourself for advice, essentially.
Well,
and then projecting that onto some divine being.
Well, and that is where this starts making a difference, see? Because here's a student that instead of being informed by what we've learned from social science and like aggression and violence and things like that, and allowing that to shape her decisions, like the first time he hit her, there should have been a red flag or a yellow flag go up, and it should have been explored.
I mean, I would call it a safe red flag.
Yeah, I mean...
Physical violence, yeah.
I mean, I would say, why did this happen? And how do I know it's not going to happen again? Because we know what causes some of these things. And it's not just, like a Dickens' Christmas Carol, you might be part of an underdone potato. Well, I don't know anybody that ate a raw potato and then saw a ghost. Okay, so like that,
right.
It's just like an exaggeration. But
well, maybe when they were putting arsenic and everything, that was more likely.
You don't hit somebody from putting too much hot sauce on your taco. You know, there is something deeper going on there that needs to be addressed, and we know how to address it. Now, when somebody wants to ignore that and then somehow just drift through life believing that God's going to magically make everybody act the way they should and fall into place, that is basically just living by a pre-scientific, superstitious type worldview. And I'm going to say this. All right. I cannot buy into a view of religion where we have a creator who gave us minds superior to the rest of creation, but he doesn't want us to use them to develop and become responsible. He wants us to basically ignore our brains and not learn anything and then still rely on divine magic. That was something, I'm sorry, but that is just something that's invented by weak-minded people who want to put themselves on the same level as people who are smarter than them. And I hate to say that, but that has been always the way I've felt ever since I was a teenager. It's just a way of people trying to level. They don't want to admit that some people have more insight into things than they do. And they want to just make everything magical because then now it's all equal. Doesn't matter. You get better grades than me and you got more education than me. I've got these revelations that are going to inform me. And so, I'm going to make as good decisions as you are. And if that's what people want in a kind of religion, that may be okay for themselves if they don't want to improve themselves and improve their lot in life. But I'm not going to endorse or embrace that kind of a religion where there's a creator who wants everybody to stay stupid and ignorant and vulnerable. Okay,
well,
I'm being a little angry here,
I think you're right, and I think particularly if you look, not to turn too political too quickly, but if you look at who benefits from these types of beliefs, it's those who know. So Trump, right? We're just gonna have to get into it.
Yeah.
Trump ends up basically dissolving a lot of the EPA and taking out a lot of environmental protections,
right?
Because all the experts, at the EPA get fired because they won't go along with it,
right?
Because they know he's wrong,
right.
And now you have his Supreme Court justices overturning Enron, right? Or was it Enron or? Chevron or something.
Chevron.
The-
Chevron.
Yeah, Chevron. Which basically, for those who aren't like up to date on that, Chevron was a case where essentially the enforcement of legislative
Right.
regulations in industry was delegated to experts in the field.
Right.
So experts in environmental protection, in water, in soil, and all these sorts of things would be the ones guiding the enforcement of regulations.
Right.
The overturning of that means that the enforcement of these regulations is now down to Congress, and people who are elected to Congress are morons.
Yeah,
and
most of them. Most
well,
of them.
and they're not the key thing is even the smart ones know. The smart ones are the ones who know. They're not experts, and so they shouldn't be the ones dictating the exact parameters of the enforcement of these regulations.
Right. Right.
That is a pre-scientific worldview at work, because it's all just like, well, the scientific experts, the people who have trained and read and are active in the field, they don't know any better than because they're not elected.
Right.
They don't know any better than some idiot in Congress.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the consequence of the pre-scientific worldview.
Yeah. There's just so much here. We didn't even get into it. And I know we're pretty much out of time already, but maybe we do another episode, because there's still maybe the issue we get into at some point is what should the average person know scientifically? High school graduates or, whatever. What does the average citizen should know about the world that some people just don't seem to know?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not really so worried whether somebody can point to Belarus on a map, but I think somebody ought to be able to at least name the 7 continents and know something, like whenever they're reading about climate change, that they know how the climate actually works. They should know enough about it to be able to research it. It's just like when you've got somebody that is going to operate an automobile, they should at least know, we talked about that, but they should have some kind of idea as to how it actually works.
Yeah, I'm going to have to apologize to our audience. I have a neighbor running a chainsaw, if you can hear it in the back.
That's what it is. I thought it was some kind of feedback coming in on my...
No, that's my neighbor.
Oh, okay. All right.
Sorry about that.
No,
folks.
It's just very faint, so it's kind of hard to tell what it is. So anyway.
It's loud here.
All right. So anyway, I guess the software is filtering some of this out. Well, we're not going to be able to work this as thoroughly as maybe we need to, but we can come back to some of this a little bit later, reorganize it, and
well, and so just so our audience knows, we might be taking a couple week hiatus. Week or two. I'm in the process of moving currently, so. We might come back with this topic again next time, but it might be a couple weeks down the road. So hang tight, leave us reviews, and get in touch with us over email. We will be monitoring the email still, taking suggestions or comments, all that good stuff while we are on break, but we will be back in a couple weeks.
Yeah, we tried to do like Elvis before he went into the army. Elvis recorded like enough songs that they could release albums while he was in the army.
Yeah.
So we've recorded a couple episodes here while Isaac gets ready to pack and starts packing stuff up and moves. And so anyway, we've enjoyed our time here, and I hope you found this interesting. We indeed may come back to this because there's still a lot more I want to talk about, but this is something near and dear to my heart. So, but we hope it's been beneficial to you, and you've taken some encouragement from it. And so anyway, we want to wish all of you a great day. And if the world doesn't end before, especially after this election, we will be back. with another episode. Take care and God bless.